I paid insurance for this product that's on fire. What do you mean the insurance market hasn't gone up? That, I think, is that really big, like, holy crap moment. Like, did these guys, like, win but not? And I think the answer is yeah.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers, for storytellers, and movie fanatics alike, so that we can tell better stories ourselves. I'm your host, as always, Maverick, and today we have with us our wonderful guest back to join us again, Philip. Philip, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, today, you all know, you saw the title. We already know. We're just talking about The Big Short. Right? Right.
That's right.
Yeah, we are. We're talking about The Big Short. So The Big Short is, what is The Big Short? It is a 2015 biographical crime comedy drama. So they tried to rumble and tie everything up in one, with a screenplay by Charles Randolph and Adam McKay, and directed by Adam McKay. It is based on the book The Big Short, Inside the Doomsday Machine by Michael Lewis, starring Christian Bale as Michael Burry, Steve Carell as Mark Baum, Ryan Gosling as Jared Vanette, and Brad Pitt as Ben Rickard. And I believe most of these characters, other than Michael Burry, is based on other real-life people, but that's not their actual name. So my understanding is that Mark Baum's actual name was Steve Eisman. Jared Vanette's was based off of a person named Greg Lippman, and Ben Rickard was based on someone named Ben Hockett. I didn't look up the other people, but those were the primary characters for our analysis. There's also the two young men who I did not actually go into, Charlie and Jamie. But anyways, little fun fact is that's not their actual names. I thought they were, except for Michael Burry, who is pretty renowned, I suppose, known for his discussion on this space. Anyways, Philip, you want to tell us what The Big Short is about?
Yeah, The Big Short is, the long and short of The Big Short is that it is a movie about the 2008 financial crisis and the housing crash. It follows three separate storylines that are loosely based on the same investment concept called shorting. And it's these three groups of people as they navigate the insanity of what was going on in the housing market in 2007 and 2008 and making money off of it. This story really explores how they got to where they are, what the market was looking like at that time, lives of Americans in that space, and the economy, and what the fallout of that looked like. So that is a very basic overview of what the movie's about.
Yeah, and it's really it's important to note it in that way because this plot is primarily driven by societal events, right? It's not one that's very, this is this person going through this great arc of where they're trying to get to. You know, they're not trying to have Frodo throw the ring into Mount Doom here. You're having, this is what's happening in society and how do these people deal with it. So it's very interesting in regards to how the plot is structured. But anyways, when you think of this movie, what do you most enjoyed about this movie as it's an iconic movie in the world today, and maybe why does it stick out to you as a film today?
I think because it works and it shouldn't. It's like you said at the beginning, the genre of the movie is like it's a semi-comedic drama documentary. It's got this, I mean, it starts with a quote from Mark Twain, who I love Mark Twain. And it's just, it's something like, it's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And so that just sets the tone for the entire movie. You get this kind of lilting music and this nice little basic scene in the mountainside, and you get this quote, and you're like, what does this have to do with anything? And then Ryan Gosling comes on, and he's explaining what collateralized mortgage obligation or collateralized debt obligations to you, which is so boring.
Yeah.
Bonds are not interesting. It's not something that people in general know about. It's not something they want to know about.
Yeah.
And the movie, not only do they know that, they regularly acknowledge it, and they bring in Anthony Bourdain, Selena Gomez, Margot Robbie in a bubble bath with champagne. Like, just
Yeah.
these really funny moments to explain. They're like, we can't fit this into the story organically. Here you go. We're just going to
Right.
dump a bunch of exposition on you.
Right.
And they do it in a kind of tongue-in-cheek, acknowledging, yeah, we both know what's going on. We're going to take out a story for a second, but we'll put you right back in.
Right.
And it
Right.
shouldn't work as well as it does, but I think they did a really good job with it. And it makes it fast-paced and funny, and it makes it so that you can follow the story and not get bored. Which in a 2-hour movie about the financial crisis and shorting the housing market is not a small feat. So I think that's probably my favorite thing about the movie. I think the filmmakers did a really excellent job.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. No, I know for myself, it's like I'm the kind of guy that will watch a documentary and, sit there and be fascinated by something that goes on for hours and hours, right? I watch the WeWork documentary. I'm like, wow, this is so crazy, right? But then, other people are going to be like, dude, this is boring. Why are you watching this? So it is a struggle, right? How do you, especially because, and like you said, they acknowledge this, is that there are some very complex ideas in this movie. And they even, to a certain degree, say that some of these ideas, or at least they say, I don't know if it is because I don't work in the industry, but that these ideas are complex because they want them to be complex. They don't want people to necessarily understand what's going on in the market. And so to bring it down to earth and make it palatable for the everyday person, they take all these different techniques to make it effective. And it's very interesting how they do that. So we'll get into that for sure. But anything that you saw in this movie that you were like, man, I really wish they did that different?
Oh, yeah. I love movies like this in general. Like The Other Guys is kind of similar in some ways. They talk a lot about Ponzi schemes in that movie. And the conclusions of these movies they always fall short, in my opinion. You've got at the end of this movie, they talk about you get this kind of, again, tongue-in-cheek moment where Ryan Gosling is narrating, and he's like, and they overhauled the banking system, and they put in a bunch of new regulations, and the government cracked down on all this stuff. And he goes, actually, none of that happened. And I go, okay, we just spent an entire movie talking about how the government and banks are corrupt and in bed with one another and colluded to create this environment. And whether or not you believe it was due to incompetence or whether it was due to malice and intentionally done, you have to turn around and go, your solution is give the government more say over what happens here. You want the government to regulate more of the industry. And the thing that people need to understand is that the financial industry is extremely regulated. You've got FINRA, you've got the SEC, you've got state organizations, state regulators, and in general, it's very closely monitored and watched. People get thrown out of the industry all the time, and you have to be careful what you do and what you say. But if you have your Series 7 or you pass your Series 66, the first thing you'll notice is that there's all of these exceptions carved out for banks and for big financial institutions. And so JP Morgan Chase and other large banks that helped create the Federal Reserve and helped write these laws got these out. And the first thing that any new law is going to do is it's going to carve out an exception for the big boys that already exist. So it's laughable, in my opinion, to come to the conclusion that you need to give the government more power, because all it's going to do is it's going to create more red tape for everybody else, and it's going to leave the banks in an even stronger position. So that's my biggest issue with the movie.
Yeah, the conclusion. That's interesting. That's the big takeaway is the conclusion is very different from. It's interesting too, because I guess how the movie leaves you is very much the taste you get about the movie. It's like, okay, so what is the conclusion of all of this? And there's definitely the feel that the government comes down on the banks and says, all right, we're going to step it up from here on out, right? But you are right. The entire movie breathes at the same time about how there was corruption between the parties and that they were helping each other out. So how does that make sense as a conclusion? Not sure, but I don't think most people are really thinking about that.
Yeah. So that's why I'm pointing it out, because that's what I'm thinking about at the end of that movie.
Nice. Well, so we have the 9-point rating system we always use to review these movies. What did you give this movie off of the 9 points?
So I gave it a 7.1. I actually thought it would be higher than that, but I went through it and there were a couple of areas where I just thought it was not as strong, maybe, after thinking about it for a minute, which I guess is kind of the point of rating it. But 7.1 I feel like is a pretty good number for what I think is a great movie.
Oh, yeah. No, and I always say anything that's above like a 6.5 for me is like you're rocking it, you're doing amazing. This is a solid story, and like anyone should appreciate, at least even if they don't enjoy the movie themselves, they should appreciate the movie for how well it has been crafted. You're really talking about rock stars once you get into like 8 and if you can get to a 9, a full 9, like that's crazy. So for myself, I got a 6.8. So this is pretty close for us.
Yeah.
Pretty toe to toe. Not quite like I don't remember what we gave for Wonka, but I recall both of those were kind of dog water.
Yeah, they were good.
Yeah, and then we were opposite spectrums for Lord of the Rings. So this guy is pretty toe to toe. That's pretty cool. We'll see if those are different or if those are for the same reason. So we'll get into that today. But the opening scene is always what first catches everyone's attention and says, "Oh, this is why I want to keep watching. This is really good." What did you think about how they opened up this movie with that explanation of the mortgage industry and how it changed? And then, of course, Ryan Gosling's basically Ryan Gosling's introduction.
Yeah. I think they did a great job with it. I didn't give it full points. I gave it just under full points for this, mainly because it doesn't fit a traditional kind of opening. It's really difficult when the character, I mean, really, I guess you could argue that like there are main characters in this movie, but the movie's really about a market crash. Like It's an amorphous kind of concept more than anything else. So discussing that as an opening arc is very, very difficult. And I thought they did a really good job of doing that and introducing the characters.
Yeah.
But that very brief overview of like, okay, we've got to get out. We've got to get out 30 years of banking history, explain collateralized mortgage obligations, and set up the story for these 3 different groups to come in and talk about it throughout the movie. So yeah. I thought that they did a really good job with what they had.
Yeah, no, it is interesting to think about the opener, because I agree. I think I gave it like midway, slightly better than midway for myself. I thought it was very good explaining the topic of the mortgage crisis and like how we have this whole setup to begin with, right? And almost giving it a stodgy old bankers to Wolf of Wall Street type change in the matter of a decade or whatever that this guy did. So it was interesting. I don't think that it's not the best opener I've seen, I think, is maybe where I'm going at it with. And I think if you weren't like big into, if you're not like a financially interested in like the financial industry, you might be like, I don't really want to watch this movie kind of thing, was the only thing that I took away from it. But it was decent. Like even people who aren't would still have some things about it that are like, oh wow, this changed the industry 100%. Like what are we gonna see come as a result of this? And you kind of know too, because it is about the financial crisis in 07, 08, right? So you know that, and that's another draw of this movie, is that it comes out like 7 years after the actual events occur. And so for a lot of people, you are seeing an explanation of something that happened very recently in your life. So I think that's another draw from it. Would it still be a draw for someone in like 50 years, 100 years? I'm not sure if it's going to be the same kind of draw, but it definitely has a strong draw and is very relevant to society, even to people today, because just looking back and seeing what happened. Anyways, you just touched on the main characters briefly in there. saying that there wasn't exactly one. What are your thoughts on the flaws and motivations of the main characters? Are they compelling? Are they not? Where do you land on that?
Yeah, I actually gave them high. I gave them the highest marks that I could for this because I thought they did a really good job of. We've got really, I think you've got Mark Baum, Steve Carell's character, and you've
Mm-hmm.
got Michael Burry, played by Christian
Right.
Bale,
Right.
and they are really the two that I think get the most screen time. So I
Mm-hmm.
would consider them the main characters, even though there's like another plot line. But they do a really good job of, okay, these guys' role in this movie has nothing to do with their families. It's got nothing to do with like their home lives or their or even much to do with their personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but Mark Baum's introduction is like what he barges into a therapist's group session, and he's just like hijacks the entire meeting, and he's like talking about this and that. He's got this very like he's very New York. He's
Yeah.
running over other people. The next thing he's on the phone with his wife Marissa Tomei. By the way, what a great cast! Oh my gosh, you got
Yeah.
Marissa Tomei in like a supporting role. That's amazing. Um, so you got him on the phone with her, and you get like in the first 2 minutes of meeting him, you know how he is, who he is. It helps that Ryan Gosling is narrating the entire time and is
Sure.
explaining like this is who this guy is.
Mm-hmm.
But they do a really good job, and Steve Carell's a great actor, and he's doing a really good job of like it's my cab, and he's just like having this
Yeah.
ludicrous argument while he's on the phone with his wife with a guy trying to take his cab.
Yeah.
And so you get this really, really brief look at Mark's family. Like you see his kids for half a second on the screen. And you get his
Mm-hmm.
wife and he talks about how his brother died. And then Ryan Gosling is coming in the background being like, Mark was ready to believe that the entire system was corrupt and ready to fall apart. And so
Mm-hmm.
you get really primed for what's about to happen. And then you get
Right.
Michael Burry's character, where he's got a larger background setup where you see him as like his kid and he's like kind of an outcast. He's got this glass eye. He's kind of
Mm-hmm.
odd. Then you
Mm-hmm.
see him and he's on the phone. And I can't remember. I'm mixing up the scenes. He's on the phone with one of his chief investors quite a bit.
Right.
But you see him in these moments where he's either writing an email and explaining like, at the end of the movie when he's explaining that his wife, like why his wife likes him. But
Mm-hmm.
even before that, you can see really brief glimpses of he's got this personal life, but he's a very odd kind of secluded guy. He's interviewing this guy for this job at the start. And he's like, you have a nice haircut. Did you do it yourself? And it's like, it's very good at kind of, okay, this is this guy's deal. He's going to be the kind of weird guy that nobody understands and is going to be an outcast,
Mm-hmm.
which sets him up really well. But you also see like a very brief glimpse of like he has this home life. He's got this family that might come into play. So those two do a really good job. Later in the movie, you see Brad Pitt, who I think really is a much better fleshed out character than Jamie and Charlie.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
he is kind of like they act like one character, honestly.
You
Where
mean
Ben
Jamie and
Rickard,
Charlie or Ben and
Jamie and
Jamie?
Shirley and Ben Rickard.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
kind of act as a singular character, where Ben Rickard is like their conscience, and the other
Mm-hmm.
two were just kind of thinking about making money.
Hmm.
Their characters are not very well fleshed out, I don't think, but you
Right.
don't have a ton of time to do that. So I gave the movie a bit of leeway there, and I thought they
Mm-hmm.
did a really good job.
Yeah, I have to think about that for a second. I definitely think I wasn't thinking of the backstory they gave for Michael Burry, right? Which I think is important because he does have a very developed backstory. I did
Yeah,
think a lot about Mark Baum's. One of the bigger things that stuck out to me was they have all these different storylines going on, right? You have the Front Point partners, you have the Brownfield, whatever they called it, and then they have Scion Capital, right? These are the
yep,
three groups that are more or less taking on the financial crisis that's about to occur and trying to get ahead of the game and make some profit off of it. And we'll get into why in just a second. But the definitely they do develop the motivations of Mark Baum very well, and the fact that they did tie in his personal life is very significant. I think it really adds a lot of value to us as the audience, not just looking at some of these characters and going, oh, they're just in it for the money, and it's the money guys versus
Yeah.
the evil industry as it is, but or the money grubbing industry. You get a sense in which there is some sort of motivation behind everything that they do that goes even beyond money, where they have a reason or a stake to be in this game. Um, I honestly actually took a lot of points away from them from this area, and one of the reasons was
Oh,
because they are so it's so fragmented amongst the three groups, and you have these different groups that are so separate, and they're more driven together by some of the themes I think in this story and how they're portrayed as a group, and they do very well at keeping that packaged together. But like you said, Ben Rickert and the crew, they get some development, but for the most part are pretty undeveloped. All of Mark Baum's associates are pretty not super well, and this is getting some into the side characters.
yeah.
But for the most part, you get some decent development with Mark Baum and even some with Michael Burry, so that will actually boost my points a bit with Michael Burry. Um, so there is something there, but I think that part of it is, and I mentioned this just earlier on, but this is a very plot driven story rather than a character driven story, right? And
Yeah.
because of that, you have a very different structure to the film because they decided to tell a story rather than saying one cohesive group that we're following. We're following three different groups of people, and they actually don't really interact at all in this
Yeah.
film. They never meet each other. Even though they're all at the same convention at that one point in Vegas, they don't really have a point of contact really, and so they're all following their own storylines around the same environment that's going on, and that was intentional by the screenplay writer Charles Randolph, and I thought it was interesting. I think one of the things that he said was he was talking about the market, and he said that the market's movements provided you with an underlying plot. You make your short deal, then the bank is trying to squeeze you out, and then it all breaks loose. So it was a pretty easy, and it provided character arcs against that. Was more or less what the film did. So I thought it was interesting that he was very intentional about how he directed this not directed wrote this film, and it was from this perspective of everything's driven by the plot, and that's intentional. And it's good. I'm not going to say it's bad because obviously I gave it a 6.8, right? I liked it a lot. But I think that because there's so many different storylines going on, it makes it hard to get into the depths of any one group and say, like, this person is really compelling. Especially because we know how the financial crisis ends. So, to a certain degree, some of the suspense is taken away. And we'll get into that more, because I don't think it's all taken away. But you know that the banks are going to collapse. So, anyways, I think that and feel free to push back. Feel free to push back. I'm not saying that this is the end all, but like this is what was going through my thoughts as I was watching this movie. Is I think that maybe if they had, for example, I think that the Brownfield associates, I forget what
I think it's
their
just
second,
Brownfield Fund.
the Brownfield Fund, is interesting, but I don't know. Like, let's just say if they had taken that time, not spent it on Brownfield, and instead spent more time on Mark Baum and Michael Burry, and tried to show how they really struggled in the midst of this, and really had you sit in the pain of their internal motivations, and maybe go into present day Michael Burry and why he needs this to work more. Maybe it would have been a more compelling story in my thoughts.
I do think I'd probably lower my score a little based on what you said. I'd probably knock it down a point. But I do think that each individual investor group kind of forms a different part of the puzzle that's really important. Like, I don't think you would argue that, like, the story, the Mark Baum storyline and Michael Burry's storyline are really important to the movie. Like, you can't have the movie work without either of them in it. You can't make a movie about just Michael Burry. It would be a lot of waiting. You can't make a movie about just Mark Baum.
Right.
It would just be too hard. But Brownfield, I feel like that's a group that you could say, yeah, we could kind of take them out of the movie and spend a little more time doing more character development on the side. But Brownfield, towards the latter half of the movie, they are trying to short more of the market. They're trying to short more of the. They're trying to buy more credit default swaps on these triple Bs and double B bonds, and they are getting priced out. They can't do it. And they're sitting there at the table in Vegas and they're like, well, this is insane. Like, we can't get into the market to buy more of these swaps because they're being priced as though the underlying asset is going to collapse. And you get this moment where Charlie realizes that, hey, if these underlying assets do collapse, we already know that the triple Bs and the triple A's and the double A's are mostly filled with subprime mortgages and crap. So we can just short those, because as soon as the triple Bs and the double Bs fail, as soon as housing foreclosure, as soon as the default rate hits 8%, then all of these bonds are going to fail. And you get that moment where they realize, oh shoot, we can short even the good stuff, even the stuff that's supposedly AAA, AA. And they do that and nobody else does. And so as part of like, you have to get this balance. And this is somewhere like I like history a lot. And I see there's like there's sometimes you can get like historical fiction, like Gladiator, where it's like, this is fun. I like to see Commodus get murdered in the gladiatorial games, even though he was, he was like stabbed to death by like a servant or something. But you could take some liberties, but if you're trying to actually have like a semi-documentary nature to the movie that you're building, I think there's only so much you can do with the story. You have to follow, at least to a certain extent, the actual events as they took place. That is an interesting concept, having the idea of like going back and forth in time, because that doesn't necessarily change what happens in the story. But I do think that when we get down to the tension side, because I gave pretty good points for the question of, how are the stakes changed and upped. I do think that the tension ramps really well throughout the movie to kind of give this other attitude. And it's also where Michael Burry's background kind of comes into play and it becomes important. But that's why I think that was probably the biggest reason Brownfield was involved, and so that you can get Ben Rickart's character, because not only do I think he's the conscience of that group that story follows, but he also, he's got a couple of really iconic lines where you've got these two guys dancing in a casino in Vegas as they just shorted all of these supposedly high quality bonds. And he says, stop dancing. You're literally dancing on the grave of the American economy. It says, here's a number for you. Every 1% inflation goes up, 40,000 people die. Yeah. And the movie's like stops and you're like, oh my gosh, it just takes you out of it for a second, because Mark Baum is very much like the corruption, the insanity. And then you get Michael Burry's side where it's just, he comes across a lot of similar things and he has these issues. Whereas Ben Rickard is kind of representative of, who's going to pay for this? The American people. It's the average guy on the street. They're going to lose everything. And so I think that is a really important reason to have him in the movie as well. Not that you couldn't have had another character do that, but I just as a little bit of pushback against like maybe removing them as characters entirely.
Yeah, and I do think that they have some similar, and I do agree that I think Ben Rickard as a character is I like him as a character. So I'm not fully committed to like, let's just throw Brownfield out, right? And the whole thing that they took on the double A's or the triple A's and no one else did is worthy of mention. I do think that some of the lines at the very least are indicated, like Mark Baum, where he's talking to the CDO manager. And we're getting into some of the details here, folks. So, if you find this is a little whatever, just skip ahead like 2 minutes or something. But, when he's talking to the CDO manager and he says, and Mark Baum realizes that everything's full of crap and the synthetic CDOs, and explaining that, and he realizes, oh my goodness, like this is a house of cards and everything's just going to fall down. Like you get some of the same sentiment, maybe not to the same degree that you get with Ben Rickard, who's very doomsday about it. Like, everyone else is going to pay, people are going to die, like this is really bad. You get some of that similar sentiment where Mark Baum is freaking out about it. So, but yeah, I do definitely see what you're saying and how they add. The other thing I was curious about, which I don't know the answer to this because I didn't get a chance to check it out, but the story is very interesting in its breaking of the wall, right? And having everyone who's in the movie acting, they'll stop for a second and be like, this actually happened, or that actually didn't happen. It was actually like this, right? And it's hilarious, right? It's super great. One of those moments where they do the same thing in Deadpool, where he'll look at the audience and then make a statement, and you're like, okay, this is silly, but you go with it because that's the feel of the movie, and they do very well with that. Right. So in that way, they go like, oh, Mark Baum really did raise his hand and make that silly comment in the middle of this lecture, right? But then they didn't see the actual pitch deck of Jared Vanette at I believe it was Lehman Brothers. But anyways, they have these moments, and I guess my question is, after that, is everything else then supposedly true to the story? Because these are technically made-up characters, right? Mark Baum isn't actually his name. Jared Vanette isn't actually his name. These kinds of things were, at the very least, pseudonyms for real people, if not fictionalized storylines for the sake of the story, with true events occurring around them, more or less, and true occurrences for certain characters actually occurring. So I guess my question is how much, obviously some things were true, some things were not, and they explicitly stated that, which made me wonder, is everything else true? Is everything else not? What all is accurate about this, and how much of it is accurate to the taking on of the financial industry by these various groups?
Yeah. I think that very likely most of the details of what happened, like the fact that you see Mark Baum going to Florida, and he goes and he speaks to the two mortgage brokers who, hilarious. I love seeing Schmidt greased up, total douchebag. It's so funny. And then going to a strip club and talking to a stripper about how she owns 5 properties. And it's I think that stuff like that is really just to show you the magnitude of what was going on. And it was just to say, look how incredibly ridiculous this is. These guys are making massive amounts of money they're getting huge kickbacks from these banks for signing mortgages with these people that have no income verification, terrible FICO scores, who are not going to be able to pay this back when the adjustable rate hits.
Right.
And they don't care because they're making money hand over fist. And I have a comment on that later if we get to it, because it's not really about the movie. It's more about my thoughts on the Fed. But there are these scenes where I think that they're probably made up. I don't know for sure. But I think for me, the most important thing is you get these moments where he says, this isn't how this happened. It's a really cool way to put this scene. But, we found the prospectus in the lobby of JP Morgan Chase. That didn't actually happen. It would have been cool if it did, but we put it in the movie like this because it was a fun way of introducing that these guys are the little guy, but boom, they're about to show the big guy up in a moment where they found something in their lobby that they rejected as well. So the 2 rejected items end up destroying this bank almost. Which is really, it's a storytelling ploy. But they explain that that's not true because it would be cool if it were. And then there are moments where you get Jared Vanette's character, Ryan Gosling, saying he did that. He actually did that. He said that. He stood up. He took the call. He did that. Can you see what I was dealing with now? That's hilarious. Ryan Gosling is one of the best comedic actors, I think, out there. He needs to do more comedies, but that's beside the point. I think that moments like that where they explain explicitly, they break the fourth wall and they explain this happened or this didn't happen, are in key moments where it's really fun for you to know, oh, this really adds to my experience that this did actually happen. That's hilarious. He is the guy that his character's portrayed as. And then beyond that, the important point of these guys actually did short the housing market successfully. That like this
Right.
did actually happen. So I think that after having watched it several times, because it's one of my favorite movies, that's my takeaway from those sorts of scenes. It doesn't make me think any like too much about like, well, is everything else they're saying true because they didn't explicitly say it
Sure.
was false, or is everything they're saying false because they didn't explicitly say it was true? I think it's more
Hmm.
like it's fun to experience the rest of the movie this way, but there's a little something it adds to the experience when you can say, okay, that didn't actually happen like that. It happened like this, but they did find this item. This is like they
Right.
did discover it accidentally. And
Yeah.
then finding like later in the movie when it's like that did actually happen, that's hilarious. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my takeaway of that.
Yeah, and that's probably a good perspective to take, especially because you can't be facting or fact checking yourself in the entire film, otherwise
Yeah.
you're gonna not have a film. So
Oh yeah.
saying, okay, when will this add to the story in a way that the audience will appreciate? I think is a great way to look at it. Yeah, cool. So, what are your thoughts on the motive? I think you mentioned that briefly, and then I don't know if you want to take on the themes as well, but I think that they're kind of connected in this one.
Yeah. I think that it's kind of interesting because I think that one of the overarching themes is there's this kind of and I don't love this when movies do this, especially when they're, you've got filmmakers and actors who don't have degrees and don't know what's going on in the financial system. But one of the overarching
Sure.
things that they're like saying is, hey, these guys are manipulating the system and we need more regulation. And that I think is a big theme throughout. You get that moment where Jamie, I think, is talking to his brother's ex-girlfriend who works for the SEC, and it shows
Yeah.
like there's way too much interplay between these two. And he's right; it's super incestuous. It's not good. But
Hmm.
I'm not in love with that, and I'll explain that later. But I think that's one of the overarching themes. Um, some of the motives for the different protagonists. You've got Mark Baum, who's very clearly set up from the beginning as like an anti-establishment kind of guy, and
Right.
he's going looking for um, trouble. He wants to find it. You get Brownfield Fund, where really what they're doing is they find value in the things that people don't think will happen. They say that explicitly in the movie.
Right.
And then you've got Michael Burry's character, who he is so he's so anal about everything. He actually read the CMO document and figured out that these mortgages are going to be worthless by the time the adjustable rates hit, and that people are going to default on their mortgages massively, and there's a money making opportunity. He's looking at it in a very scientific way. He's like, look, this is what's
Right.
going to happen. Here it goes. And I
Right.
think that and this maybe is getting a little bit into a later part of what we'll talk about during tension and revelation, but you get Mark
Uh-huh.
Bound's character who's like, this is who he is, and all of them are shocked by the extent of what's going on in the system. Even though
Right.
we get Mark Baum's character who's ready to believe it's all rigged and ready to believe it's all going to collapse. You get Brownfield Fund who's looking for what people don't expect to happen. You get Michael
Hmm.
Burry's character who he's like, this is how it's going to go. This is what's going to happen. This is just how it is. And
Yeah.
each of them has that moment where they're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And
Right.
multiple times. And I think we probably get to that during the Revelation section, so I'll bring it up now. But
Sure. Sure.
I think those are really interesting, especially Mark Baum's, where
Yeah.
he is prepared to see everything is collapsing, and even he doesn't think that it's as bad as it actually is.
Yeah. Well, especially with Mark Baum's character, because you have this background with him about his brother and suicide, and how he has some emotional mental attachment between that and the financial industry because of partially how he dealt with it, and then further on, just like the corruption he sees in the financial industry and how that affects other people's lives and ruins their lives. And so he definitely, like you said, that is part of the motivation for him to be very let's he wants to believe that this is messed up. And so you get I almost got the impression that each of these characters has something to prove in some way,
Mm,
where they're like, okay, I did the financial analysis and I know this is going to happen, and I need to prove that I was right, that I knew what was going to happen. And then you have Mark Baum, where he's like, he needs to prove that more or less the system is corrupt like he believes, and that they need to stick it to the man. And that's another thing too. Like, Ben Rickert has some background with that. Clearly, they don't explain it as much, but they
Yeah.
indicate some very like evil things maybe that he's seen, or things that he's very unhappy with, when he says things like, oh, every time there's inflation, 40,000 people die, or something along those lines. These different ideas are connecting with people who are frustrated with the system, underdog kind of spirit, have something to prove, want to stick it to the man. You get all of this sentiment. And this is what's really great, is like, despite, and this is one of the things I thought was very impressive, is like we talked about earlier, these are disparate stories that are going on. They're very, very different characters. They never meet, right? And I had some problem with that earlier, but this is one of the things where I thought was very impressive about the story, was that they all had some cohesiveness to their motivation, to why they were doing this, and it was built around these themes and these ideas that were brought up, that all in all, even though they're very different groups, you're still kind of rooting for all of them, because they all are coming from the same place of, this is wrong, and let's prove it to the world, more or less, that it's wrong. And the making of the money is important, but it's almost more symbolic to them that they were right than necessarily, at least from like a storytelling perspective. Obviously they're right to make their nut, but like from a storytelling perspective, it's more along the lines of, see, this entire time we knew. And when they have financial incentive, it almost had the pushback of the industry to try to say, you can't make money off of this, or we will survive this through our mechanisms in place, is kind of where the fight really starts to get down and dirty. So, yeah, I don't know if that was cohesive enough of a thought process right there, but that's what was going through my head on that. What are your thoughts on that, especially in relation to the big obstacle, which is this behemoth of a financial industry?
Yeah, I think they do a really good job of showing that the rules are set by the industry leaders, right? So you get, there's that scene towards the end of the movie where Michael Burry's getting a call back from the representative from Goldman Sachs, and he's like, "Oh, we have an update on your credit default swaps. They're now worth the amount of money that they are actually worth. You're welcome." And his character straight up says, "I think what you actually mean is that you have offloaded all of your positions, and you are now free because you have a net positive position in credit default swaps yourselves. You are now free to value my positions at their actual value." And the guy on the other end goes, "I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to say to that." And he goes, "I think you already said it." And that is just really representative of, I think, what really goes down in this movie as this is the huge problem at the end. That's like, it's not exactly what you would think. Like obviously the big problem is that there's this massive recession.
Yeah.
It's actually, turns out that everybody's operating on these platforms built by these banks. Mm-hmm. And Mark Baum's problem is that his bank might collapse and he might lose the entire position. And right. Michael Burry's problem is that the banks won't price the credit default swaps at their actual value until they can save their own butts. And there's another great movie about the financial crisis called what is it? Oh, shoot, I wrote it down. I've only seen it like once or twice. It's called Margin Call. That's what it's called.
Okay.
Margin Call is Kevin Spacey. And that is about kind of the other side, the inside of these trading platforms and these banks, when they realize what's going on. And it takes them till like subprime mortgages are actually defaulting at a massive rate to get to the point where they're like, we need to offload this entire position. And it does a pretty good job of showing how cutthroat the whole thing is. You've got traders who are just dumping this position on unwary buyers who are going to be
Mm.
entirely screwed over by these soon to be worthless commodities. And then they all get fired because the bank needs to trim.
The fat.
Like, that's it. That,
Yep.
like, they dump and they get fired, and that's it. They lose all their relationships on Wall Street. So
Wow.
it's it's really interesting because you get this massive obstacle that's immovable. And that's the thing that's
Mhm.
really interesting, is that they don't move the obstacle. The obstacle shifts for them at its own pace.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
you got, because Mark Baum is the only one who sits on his position
Mhm.
until it becomes entirely necessary for him to sell. But even he is beholden. Like, who's buying his position? It's a
Right.
bank. Like,
Right.
so it's really interesting that this obstacle comes to all of them, and it kind of makes it I think is probably the most compelling part of the story as to why we need overhaul in the system. Is these three guys spotted a problem, they exploited it, they're going to make money, they're going to be heroes, and they can't do it because the system is allowing these banks to just do whatever they want until everything collapses. So
Right.
that I thought that the obstacle was quite good and really too real, if we're being honest.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I thought that this was, especially because usually you're having not always the case, right? But in a lot of movies, a majority of movies, the obstacle in the way of the protagonist is usually embodied in a person or a group, whereas in this case, it's more of a machine, a giant societal
Yeah.
machine that has been built up over time until it's such a big behemoth that the question is, like exactly like you said, it moves on its own pace. And what was really interesting, because I thought, oh, it's like, will they make their money or will they not? When you first watch this movie, you're like, well, okay, clearly they're going to make their movie, or I mean, make their money, or else why would they make the movie, right? But then the way they portray it is more, okay, we know the system is going to collapse. The question is this machine so big that it can still screw you over even as it's going down? And I think that was what was so compelling, because you see that as things ratchet up, their ability to wait out the system, right? Pay those the what was it, the monthly
It's literally premiums like an insurance policy. Yeah.
right. If you can pay the, like, they're running out of space to pay the insurance premiums, and they have to sell off other assets or stocks that they were holding on to and whatnot, right? For the sake of making this position still work, and try to wait it out long enough, in the case of Michael Burry specifically, to actually make a profit off of this and make good on their bet. So it's definitely, they did very well, and this is getting some into the heightened tension, but yeah, it's definitely a fascinating way that they developed the story, so that even though you know what's going to happen with um the end of the story, everyone knows the recession occurred, you still have this thing of, oh, are they going to be able to stick it to the system? Do the underdogs actually make it out and make it out alive, more or less, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so they do that very well. Yeah, I know you had some thoughts you wanted to mention earlier, so I feel like it's a great opportunity to hand it over to you.
So are we getting more into like the heightened tension
Yes,
sections?
yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think you touched on a lot of those important parts, specifically Michael Burry. You
Hmm.
get to see a lot more of him and his personal life throughout the movie. I think you don't really see his wife and his kid at all. You see a picture of them. You see a text he gets from them, which is like a nice moment. It's a humanizing moment for him as a character because like he's so extremely robotic in the way that he behaves. He's so unemotional about the fact that his fund is down. Like, at the start of the movie, you can see they've got that big whiteboard. It's like he's up like 38% or something. It's like almost 40%, which is awesome. That's amazing returns.
Right.
Um, and then you see throughout the movie, he comes back and it's like, okay, it's -7 or it's -12 or 11 or whatever.
Yeah.
And he's got these big investors breathing down his neck. There are people that are like, I'm going to sue you. I'm coming after you. Where is my money? And
Yeah.
you've got the I can't remember the name of the character, but the guy who helped him start the fund is there, and he doesn't trust him. He doesn't believe him,
Yeah.
and he doesn't bother looking at all. He listens to what
Yeah.
Michael Burry has to say, and he goes, no, you're wrong. The housing market
Mhm.
has never failed. It's going to be fine. You're wrong. Nobody actually
Mhm.
looks like he did.
Yeah.
He's the only one that's looking. So you have this tension where he starts out, he's like, I'm going to do this. And the big investor's like, well, that's so dumb. Don't do that. And he goes, I'm going to do it
Yeah.
anyways. So then he goes around
Yeah.
and he's very calm and he's doing this one by one. He's grabbing mugs for his son. And like, then as the movie progresses, it gets slowly more and more intense where it's like these phone calls are getting less and less friendly. And then it finally culminates in like this guy shows up to his office and he's like screaming at him. And
Yeah.
he's got this metal music playing constantly more and more throughout the movie. He's, in his basement banging on his drums when he is like, he thinks that the financial system is fraudulent, entirely fraudulent. And he's like, I just made this massive bet that I thought I know what I'm talking about. I looked at the numbers. I know this is true. And he's so frustrated because he's like, I mean, really, it kind of presents him as like he's an MD. He's like a scientist. He's this is how it works. This is how it goes. And he's in this system where he's like, I think it might be entirely fraudulent now. And he goes from being assured to being a nervous wreck who's screaming in his office and lying on the ground in the fetal position, who's like leaving work and talking to his only remaining employee and going, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know how I could possibly be wrong. And like that is some really good tension for his character, for somebody who doesn't seem like he has many emotions, where his entire world is collapsing because the system he works in that he thought he understood is incredibly flawed and maybe entirely fraudulent. So I would imagine like it really takes him completely for a whirl. And then you've got like Mark Baum's character, who starts out by being, we talked a lot about this. He starts out by being super ready to believe that everything's falling apart. And then when he starts hearing it, he's like, no way. And then he goes, okay, yeah, you're right. It is falling apart. And then he gets further down the rabbit hole and he keeps going, are we sure about this? I don't know that we want to pay this premium now. Like, you guys are being ridiculous. Like, maybe we're wrong about this. So he's more emotional. And then he goes and he talks to that guy in Vegas. And he's thinking,
the CDO
synthetic
manager.
CDOs? What on earth are you he's saying, you know what? I don't care. You're wrong. You're wrong, and I'm investing like you're wrong. And so for him, it doesn't. He's like, it might all be fraudulent. I don't care. Screw you. So he goes for it with kind of wild abandon, but it like ratchets up the tension massively because you've got this. He's got this experience where he's just, you know what? I don't care what it does to the fund. I'm going to do it. And you've got the side characters, specifically. I can't remember his character's name. The guy from Secession. Blanking on his name right now.
You're talking about the guy who's like helping him to run the fund for Front Point Partners.
Yeah, I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
But he is saying, we have a fiduciary duty to our investors, which they do. And he's saying, Mark Baum was saying, no. Well, why should we play by the rules? No one else is. And you get to the end of this story where you get this guy who starts out as being, screw you, the system's corrupt, I don't trust anybody. And you get to the end and you're like, no, he trusted some things. Now he's just completely out. Like nope, nothing is trustworthy. So you get this. It's really fun to see his character kind of devolve like that. I mean, fun, maybe not the right word, but he's got this insane tension ratcheted on him throughout the movie, and then finally it kind of explodes in this kind of, he made a bunch of money and he made the right call, but at what cost? Like he's lost complete faith in the system. And then Brownfield, it's kind of. It's less. Their tension is a lot more like, oh my gosh, this is all of our money. We might lose everything. It's all their own money. So for them, it's very much, please get this traded. We've got to get this out of our hands. So I think for them, it's not as well thought out. But
Sure. Because
definitely, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no. It's just, especially for them, it's more about, like you said, they're there to make their money, and Ben is the conscience who's like, hey, you realize the societal ramifications that are about to occur because of this, and for them, you do get that inflection point, but it's definitely still a lot about, oh my goodness, I'm going to lose everything if this occurs. Whereas, with Mark especially, you get more of that. This is all evil and this is all wrong.
Yeah.
One thing I did like about Michael Burry's, which I believe was intentional, was leading back to the opening quote from Mark Twain, where they say, "It doesn't matter." What's most scary, or what is most to be concerned about, is a man who is wrong who 100% believes he is right.
Right.
Right. And I thought it was interesting that you see that, and this is about the financial recession, and to some degree you're led to assume that the quote is talking about all of the bankers who thought that there was no way that the mortgage system could collapse. And then you have that inflection point with Michael Burry where he's talking to his last employee, and the employee says, well, what if you're wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of comes to that conclusion, is where Michael's like, well, maybe I am wrong. I could actually be wrong. And you almost get this reversal of that quote in the audience and in Michael's mind, where he goes, I was so sure that I was right, but what if I'm not? And that changes everything about this entire bet, and that means that I lose everything. So I thought that was interesting, especially from a storytelling technique, to take that and use something they introduced right at the start of the movie to draw into question and make you doubt, is Michael going to make it out of this alive? Because he's doing the very thing that he's saying everyone else is doing, where they believe it is this way, it has to be this way, and they're just wrong. Someone has to be wrong. Is it Michael? Maybe it's Michael, So they did very well with some of those things, just bringing you in and saying, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to these characters?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. No, I do think there's a lot of fun little moments throughout the movie that are really interesting. Like, I think they use the B-roll to really good effect, especially if you've seen it more than once. One watching, there's so much going on, like just trying to learn what all the phrases mean and what they're talking about. And yeah, I get that Anthony Bourdain explains how CMO works. I get that, but it doesn't make it easier to understand, really. It's difficult. So it's hard to kind of see this the first time or even the second time you watch it. But they do a lot of these B-roll shots where you've got one I'm thinking of now is they're in Vegas, and you got everybody's leaving from Vegas to their car, and they're walking out of the building, and you get the guy that was eating with Mark Baum in the restaurant, who's the synthetic CDO manager. And he walks out, he gets in a stretch limo, and he rides off. Brownfield Fund, they get in a taxi, and they go to the airport. You get what's her name? Jamie's brother's ex-girlfriend, Jillian.
Oh, yeah.
She walks out with this guy who works at Goldman.
Right.
He gets in a Range Rover. She gets in a taxi. So she works for the SEC and gets in a taxi. He gets in a Range Rover. He works for Goldman. And like you just see this juxtaposition of like these people live very different lives, and then the camera pans around and you see just an underpass with a tent.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I did think that was a good dichotomy that they put right there. Yeah.
So you get to see this, and then again throughout the movie, you get introduced to these characters, like the guy who's renting this house from this landlord who's not paying his mortgage. You get the real estate agent and her buddy, and you get the two mortgage brokers, and the real estate agent is at like a get rich quick seminar at the end with her buddy, and they're like trying to make money off the real estate market again. And you get the mortgage brokers are like at a job fair looking very sad. That's always gets me. And then
Yeah.
you've got the poor guy who's just living in this, who is renting this apartment. He's living out of a van with his kid and his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And so you
Yeah.
see again throughout the movie, they have these fun. I say fun. It's fun for the watcher to kind of see how they
Right.
put these things together. But you
Mm-hmm.
get these moments where you go, "Wow, this impacted every single one of these people you meet." Like you get these guys who are making buku bucks off of selling mortgages. You get this woman who's making great money off of this real estate market, and you get this guy who's not doing too well. It affects everybody. Everybody's gone.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to figure out their lives after this whole collapse happens. And I just think they do a pretty good job of like taking existing characters from the movie and just kind of showing you like, oh, they ended up here doing this, they ended up here doing this, and where they ended up, what they're doing, or what they're doing, I should say, doesn't matter so much as the fact that nobody's doing what they were doing at the start.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, just to show the whole ramifications, and especially I thought that the average Joe who was just renting his apartment and
Yeah.
questions, am I gonna have to move out? We just got settled down more or less, and seeing that, okay, and that does provide some sobering reality that brings it down to how the financial recession actually did affect families, where yeah, they made their buck off of this, but at the end of the day, you still see the everyday person getting absolutely screwed over by
Yep.
what happened. And just giving that down to earth, sobering reality to the movie, I think was actually an important thing that they integrated into how the story was told.
Yeah. Yeah. And not just in the story, because obviously you get Ryan Gosling's character who's narrating, who says they blamed immigrants and poor people and they bailed out the banks and the average person paid for it, which is, the bailouts were paid for by taxpayer dollars. So yeah, the average guy paid to bail out these banks who,
Mm-hmm.
who according to the movie, did this on purpose. They knew what they were doing.
Right.
So,
Right.
but it is fun that even though they have a narrator, they're not just leaning on him solely, which I appreciate.
Yeah. What were your thoughts on the revelations in this movie and the ending in particular? Was the ending surprising? Was there revelations that really took a twist on the story as it was being told? What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you touched on this a bit, and you had some really, like, I had similar thoughts to you on this, which is, well, it's the 2008 financial crisis. We know what happens. It sucked.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that long ago. Like,
Yeah.
most of us remember living through it. So
Yeah.
you, like, what surprises there really? Okay, the surprise is like, they're shorting the housing market. Okay, so that's kind of the twist on it. And then it's, okay, so they're shorting the housing market, but like you said, they wouldn't be making a movie about this if they'd failed, because so many people tried doing things that failed in that period of time. Like, they wouldn't be special unless they won.
Right.
But then getting the tension of really the shock and the revelation isn't that they're shorting the housing market, isn't that the housing market's going to collapse, but the reason that it's happening, or the given reason that it's happening, which is just the incredible amount of fraudulent activity that's going on, that's creating these rating systems that are screwed up, and these bonds that are worthless, that are being traded as though they're worth something, and then the system not willing to acknowledge that the bonds are worth nothing because they hold a positive position in the bonds. And that is like the big revelation at the end, is where everybody realizes they're sitting on these positions and they're paying these massive premiums, and they're going, what's going on? I paid insurance for this product that's on fire. What do you mean the insurance market hasn't gone up? So that, I think, is that really big, like, holy crap moment. Like, did these guys like win but not? And I think the answer is they got money, but they came out of the other end just completely disenchanted. So I think that is, like you were saying earlier, that's really the revelation. That's really the twist and the big surprise.
Right. Yeah, and I definitely, this movie was interesting because normally for me it's like, is there a revelation in the story that changes everything, where you look back, you're like, oh my goodness, this gives a whole different flavor to what was going on earlier. And to a certain degree, I almost want to say no, but there's these small revelations that over time build into this grand picture of how corrupt the system is. And maybe this is because this film is somewhat documentary style, or a lot of what happened is true. The story that is told is one that affects us personally, where you look at how, okay, the rating system, which is probably the biggest example, because then Brownfield tries to go and sue them unsuccessfully, but they realize that, okay, we have a system in place that should hypothetically give confidence that, okay, everything is good and happy, but it turns out it's actually the opposite, where they're covering each other's butts because they have a financial incentive to do so. And so it just gives the vastness of the corruption that's in the system, and that's what impacted everyone back in 2008. So you look at that and you go, that's... I think all that together builds into a revelation of just how maybe evil or corrupted the system was. And it's crazy to think about, like, this was truly protecting the big guy, and none of the little guys were shielded from this, and everyone else paid the bill. So yeah, it's very... I did give it full points on this, like, and I was kind of surprised that I did, but I think part of that is because of how deep that they go in regards to the corruption in ways that, like, you wouldn't have even... I guess if you're very jaded, maybe you would think it goes that far, but the average person probably didn't realize how deep it could go. And obviously, maybe you would be able to speak to more of how much of that is accurate or not. But I thought it was very interesting, at least from how the story played out.
Yeah, we can take, if you have the time and you want a brief kind of overview of my thoughts on that, we can kind of take a tangent line for a second here on that.
Let's save that bit for the end.
Okay,
we're almost there, so let's get through the transformation, and I would love to definitely hear your thoughts on the alternate reality of the story versus true facts. Anyways, the main characters, there's a bunch of them. Do they change? Do they grow as characters? What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
the messaging.
This is one where I gave them no points. I thought, you definitely see some change, like Mark Baum and Michael Burry. We kind of talked about. But their transformation is more of a de-evolution. They kind of devolve into like more jaded kind of people. And I understand why you don't see like a whole lot of character transformation, because like you said, this is not a character driven story. It's a plot driven story.
Right.
But I didn't think that I could realistically give them any points for that. So I kind of stuck them with, I didn't give them any, I didn't take away points from them, but I didn't give them any either.
Sure. Yeah, I actually did give them a lot of points here, but I think that there is something to be said for that. And maybe the reason I saw that was because you see, so Brownfield Fund, maybe, and this goes to what you were saying earlier, right? You kind of have to see them as a singular unit. But if that's the case, then why does Ben, Ben's already jaded, the other guys kind of just come along with him. Yeah, I guess I see that maybe isn't as accurate as I thought it was. But you do see, for example, Scion Capital ends up dissolving for the most part, or they only invest in water rights.
Yeah,
I'm not. Yeah,
Michael Burry.
Not as clear on that.
I believe that he dissolved the fund and he personally invests only in water, or like that was the way the movie ended, at least.
Right. Obviously, since then he got into other things. If you were following his stuff on Twitter or X or whatever, but we're not getting into that today. Anyways, so then Front Point Partners. I guess Front Point Partners actually. The only thing I would say is it seems to indicate that maybe Mark comes to terms to some degree with his brother's suicide. But that's not even really clear, so maybe I'm stretching it to say that. So I guess you see some things happen in regards to the funds, right? You see, at least with Brownfield, Charlie stops working with the fund and ends up moving off and getting married and things like that. It indicates that Ben moves on. So I think I was taking their movement in life and saying, okay, that AKA is character development, but that's not necessarily the case. So, yeah, I think I would probably take some away from here too,
I
but not like a lot.
I think you've convinced me, specifically with Mark Baum's character. I think it is actually fair to say that he does transform and grow, specifically in regards to coming to terms with his brother's death. Because there is that
Mm-hmm.
scene where he realizes that he's not the jaded person he thought he was. He's not as strong as he thought he was. And he has like
Mm-hmm.
this moment where he breaks down to his wife and kind of talks over with her. And he goes, I offered him money. What's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just like these people. I'm such a hypocrite.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
I think you're right, actually, that's a good one. Because I was thinking mostly of Michael Burry and Brownfield Fund and all the supporting characters. I was like, none of them really do anything. Like you have at
Sure.
the end, you get like a few sentence blip about what they ended up doing, which I don't count that. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I think you convinced me. I would give him a point or two for that now, I guess, because that is a good point.
let's kind of bundle up the ending here and talk about the message that's conveyed with the story and did the movie leave you satisfied, right? Uh, what were your thoughts on how they leave you here?
So as far as whether or not the movie left me satisfied, I just gave it 0 points for that. I really didn't
Mm-hmm.
love the way that they ended the movie because it's a little bit preachy and it's a little bit, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You get these moments where you can see that there's this interplay between government and these funds and banks, and you see that the government bailed these big banks out and the system knew that they were going to do it. And
Mm-hmm.
then you have the movie ending and kind of being like, and that is why we need more government involvement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to say we need to regulate them more because in your mind you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking, oh, we need to take away their rights and need to enable the little guy more. But that's
Mm-hmm.
never how it actually works. People don't like regulations are put into place by bureaucrats who are put into positions by elected politicians who are elected into their offices using money given by large corporations and big banks. So what do you think they're going to do? Like, who do you think they're going to go to when they're drafting this stuff? Who do you think they're going to get help from when they don't know the finances and they need to talk to somebody? They're going to talk to big banks, just like they did when they wrote all these
Mm-hmm.
rules to begin with. So you
Right.
can get more regulation, and it's not going to fix the problem. We've been having bubbles
Right.
and banking collapses and all sorts of things for since the existence of this country and before the existence of this country. It happens
Mm-hmm.
since the existence of a market. So there are going to be bubbles,
Right.
specifically when you
Yeah.
have something like the Federal Reserve that exists solely to their purpose is to control inflation and to, as far as I can tell, they use their abilities to stimulate the economy and the job market. So they can do that in several different ways, and that includes, their open market commission and actual printing of money, and
Mm-hmm.
the way that they handle uh, fractional reserve. So
Right.
these banks, the reason that they kept writing these loans, which the movie doesn't ever explain, and I think it would be helpful if the movie explained it, is you get banks that are writing these loans, and there's all this hoo-ha about, oh, they've got these adjustable rates that in 2007 kick up. And that's when the
Mm-hmm.
big Armageddon happens. You get these people with these teaser rates that are very attractive. You say, look, you're going to be able to refinance in a few years and you're going to be perfectly fine. But obviously, with an adjustable rate, if the market collapses and inflation starts increasing, the Fed is going to start tightening monetary policy, and you're going to start seeing interest rates rise across the board, which means
Right.
you're not going to be able to do anything with that mortgage. You're stuck at whatever rate the adjustment kicks into, which could be
Right.
significantly more than you're currently paying. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but these banks were able to give so generously. They're able to offer mortgages to all these people, not just because it resulted in all these nice fat kickbacks for everybody, because
Mm-hmm.
even a bank in a corrupt system isn't gonna pledge itself for people that they don't think are going to pay back, unless they
Mm-hmm.
can do it really cheaply,
Right.
because it still costs them something to lend money. But
Right.
if interest rates are being held artificially low, for instance, by the Federal Reserve, and they've been doing that in order to stimulate economic growth, what you're going to see is there's going to be a whole bunch of lending and borrowing that shouldn't happen. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
this is,
Mm-hmm.
if you get a little bit more into Austrian business cycle theory, you see that business cycles are really caused by a bubble that increases and increases over time. As more and more malinvestment happens, though, rates start falling back, and when the bubble bursts and you fall into a recession, and you're on the downslope, you're in the trough of that bubble, you are
Mm-hmm.
actually in the recovery phase, where the
Right.
economy is retracting and they're pulling back from all of these enterprises that really never should have been invested in. And
Right.
things like, giving mortgages to people that have terrible FICO scores and cannot afford to pay them back. Like, that's the
Right.
sort of thing it'll pull back from. And you have this massive bloated housing market because all these contractors were building houses because they were making money hand over fist, and they could flip houses and they could build them, and everybody was buying. They never had to worry about a demand issue. So the supply was there. And suddenly you have all these empty giant houses. And
Mm-hmm.
it's because the demand was artificially inflated a by a cheap money supply. And
Mm-hmm.
when it started retracting and you see these adjustable rates hit, it was like Armageddon. So
Right.
I see the issue as one that was primarily caused by the Federal Reserve and the regulatory environment as it is. And
Mm-hmm.
so my reaction to that movie is, boy, do we need to get rid of the Fed and decrease regulation on individuals. Whereas their takeaway
Mm-hmm.
from the movie, their takeaway at the end of the story is, we need to increase regulation on banks. So that's kind of like I am not, I don't have a PhD. I'm not an expert. I know more than
Mm-hmm.
some people do. I know a lot less than others, but that's
Sure.
kind of my take. And if you look, a lot of Austrian economists predicted the 2008 recession. They predicted it.
Hmm.
And some of them were investors and they invested like that. None of them show up in this story, but it's something that you can see if you look. There's a few books that have been written about it. I'm blanking on the name of one. It's something skyscrapers. But it's all about a
Sure.
guy
Sure.
who wrote about how he predicted it, and everybody laughed at him, and then it
Uh
happened.
huh.
So
Yeah.
it's, I'm not an expert, but I have read a lot of what actual experts have said, and the story that makes the most sense, and the people that are actually able to predict these bubbles bursting are in agreement with me. So,
Nice. Yeah. Well, it's also just so interesting to see how, and this is maybe just a general fact of life, but two people will look at the same thing occurring and come to very different conclusions about what the outcome needs to be as a result, right? And a lot of it is definitely right. How much, like, what do you know? Who's all involved, and how does this even begin with, right? And not really to get uh well, I guess maybe to get a little political here, but like there's so many things, like we have so many things going on in the world today that, like, to answer one question, you have all of these different things that have been built up over time, that is, to answer this question is now incredibly complex, because you're going back to, why was this agency created to begin with, and blah blah blah, right? And so when people give just like simple answers, like, oh, we just need more regulation or whatever, it's
right.
like, okay, well, it's not that is not just the answer. And it's like, well, obviously it should be more nuanced. It's like, well, okay, let's have a more of a conversation. But
Yeah.
anyways, that's all aside. It is definitely interesting to see the conclusions that every one of these has come to. Especially because, like you said, they say, oh, then they cracked down and they shoved it up, the banks and all that stuff. And then you go, well, actually, no, that didn't happen. And the average person pays for it. And that's the takeaway of this film, is that everyone got screwed over.
Well, that part is right. The average guy definitely got screwed. Like, regardless of who you think is right, like, everybody can agree
Yeah,
that the average Joe on the street got totally boned.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So if you were to look at this film, right, and let's just say you were the creator of the dialogue here, or the creator of the arc. If there was one thing you could do to make this better, what would you take a stab at, and how do you think you would improve it?
Yeah. I think that as far as like the entertainment value, it's really excellent. I've enjoyed watching it every time I've watched it, and
Yeah.
I think they do a good job with dialogue and the story, as evidenced by my score. I'd probably say that the last thing I would do is I would honestly maybe even just remove the end and
Mm-hmm.
just say, this is how it ended. We're not going to make a comment about, we're not going to make a judgment as to how this would be fixed or what exactly went
Mm-hmm.
wrong. We showed you that there's rampant corruption and there are huge issues in the financial industry
Mm-hmm.
and, frankly, the government. And that's all we're going to say. And we're going to leave it up to the individual, which I think more movies really need to do. Because when was the last time your mind was changed by the last 30 seconds of the movie where they're preaching at you? Never. I
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
going to
Yeah.
either you're going to piss off the people that don't agree with you, and the people that do agree with you that they already agree with you. So what the heck is the point of this? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that if I were going to change it, I would probably I would either change the end to be significantly softer in landing than it is, or I would just
Mm-hmm.
slop it off entirely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely fair. I think that most of the movies that have impact anyways are ones that don't necessarily uh preach at you. And this is not a I don't know why I keep bringing this up recently in the podcast, but it just has been, maybe I need to review it. But La La Land, right?
Oh
Where
yeah,
it's like it's a film where they don't really tell you like this is how it needs to end, right? Or like this is the outcome of relationships or whatever, but you see just that, that sad look on each other's eyes where they didn't end up together, but that's how it needed to be for them, and at the end of the day, that's okay. And just pans away from that, or I forget exactly what the ending shot is exactly, but it's more or less that's the sentiment you get left with, and it's they're not preaching at you. They're not telling you how their like relationships need to be in general, but it's just that moment and encapsulating how the rest of it goes on. And maybe something like that could have been integrated into this story, right? Where they walk away with their money, maybe Ryan Gosling's character has a little monologue about, yeah, I made it out rich, and then it goes over to the man who's now homeless with his family, living outside of his van or his car, and just the sobering reality of that, and then just leaving it at that, right? That is a very real consequences of everything that actually went on.
yeah,
So I definitely think that there is room for improvement, especially in the monologues. I think they did pretty well throughout the movie. Maybe at the end, definitely it would be interesting to see, because it's not like people won't take away something based on
it,
lopping off that end, for sure. I think you still can take away a lot of interesting things about the corruption that went on, and sticking it to the man and all that kind of stuff.
yeah, yeah.
But cool. So would you change your rating based off of this
I
conversation?
think that I both came up and went down at least 1 or 2 points in both directions. So I think it
Uh-huh.
actually evened out to about the same score.
Yeah, I probably would agree, because you had some really good points, and then it was so funny to hear us talking, and then I'd be like, "Oh, I think you convinced me this way," and you're like, "Well, I think you convinced me the other way," and so
Right?
there was like several times I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's a little weird,"
You came
but
up a
here we
little
are.
and I came down a little. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So 6.8, 7, wherever we were at there, it's probably about there still, and that's
Yeah.
that's pretty good.
Yeah.
It's still a great movie. Really enjoyed watching it. Would watch it again. And there we go. I think that's it.
All right.
That's the pod. That's the pod. We are done. We will be back as always next week, and we hope to see each of you back with us then.